You may be surprised at just how powerfully you're affected by the clarity of the message you're about to hear, the message that lives in every cell of your body. The discovery of a literal text message in the cells of all life now gives entirely new meaning to our time in history. I said, what would it mean to find the actual words of an ancient message written as the DNA of each cell of every life? What would it mean if we discovered undeniable proof, the actual words of an ancient message coded into the DNA of life itself, into the cells of our bodies? Is it possible? For hundreds of thousands of years, each of us has carried a message from the day of our origin, a message that could only be translated when we evolved to the place where we could recognize it and read it and act on it. Well, if the answer is yes, we've got to ask ourselves, what would such a message say? Rather than record it on a single scroll or inscribe it in a temple wall that could crumble into dust over time, what if the message from our past was left within life itself? What if the message is inside of us, perfectly replicated inside of each of the 50 trillion or so cells of our bodies, stored in the living library of the 6 billion plus people of our world? Now that's the way to preserve a message. From the healing of our bodies, the peace of our world. Such a universal message would tell us that we're more than any disease that we may ever experience. We're greater than the differences that have separated us in the past. It tells us that we're family. No matter what we believe or how we live, no matter what our religions or heritage or bloodlines or borders, we'd all carry precisely the same message. If we were to find such a message, we'd be given the reason to see ourselves differently. Well, we no longer have to ask these questions as what if, because this is precisely what has happened. There is a message in our DNA. It exists. It's been revealed, it's been read, it's been translated, and by following the instructions left to us in some of our most ancient and cherished traditions, we can now literally read the code of life as the letters of ancient alphabets. And when we do so, our genetic code becomes words, and the words become sentences. Whoever, whatever is responsible for our being here may have left something hidden for us, deep in the mystery of our lives long ago. You may be surprised at just how powerfully you're affected by the clarity of the message you're about to hear, the message that lives in every cell of your body. The emotional experience that goes along with researching this kind of information has had a tremendously profound and powerful effect on me personally. I've always believed that we are here on purpose, that we're an intentional species, that we're a product of an intentional creation that began long ago. And while I confess I've never fully understood the how or the why of our existence, I am convinced beyond any reasonable doubt. When I see the complexity of life and the complexity of the DNA in our bodies, I know that we're here by design. My thinking at the time was that if we are, in fact, here on purpose, then it'd make perfect sense that somewhere in our past, who or whatever is responsible for our being here, would have left us a clue to tell us that we're here on purpose. My search led me into some of the most remote and ancient, rugged, pristine places remaining on the face of the earth today. Places where those who have come before us have stored what they knew in their time for the people who would live in their future. From the temples of Egypt's deserts, tiny villages in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia and Peru, into the ancient monasteries of the highlands of central Tibet and the Tibetan Plateau. I had the opportunity to meet with the people and read their records and hear their history. And as interesting as every one of these sites was, not one of them told me what I was looking for. However, they all had a common clue. And that clue simply invited me, you can probably guess, said stop looking for these answers in the world around you. You're never going to find them there. Look for the answers within. And as I saw these clues again and again, and they were so consistent over such long periods of time in so many different cultures, I had to ask myself a question. Is this the sign that tells us that maybe these clues are literal? If there is something hidden within us that tells us of our past, where would we look to find that record? In the 19th century, a historian and amateur archaeologist, for example, Heinrich Schliemann, he asked a question in his day regarding the classic book, the Iliad by Homer. and its descriptions of an ancient city of Troy, and that the stories that were described by Homer in the Iliad were metaphors for battles between the forces of light and dark, good and evil. Heinrich Schliemann looked at these clues just a little differently. He said, what if these are descriptions of an ancient city that actually existed and battles that actually occurred? What would it tell us about ourselves and our past? What would happen if we followed those clues as though they were real? Well, this is precisely what he did. He found himself at a mound of earth and began excavating in a place where no one had ever excavated before. No archaeologist had found this place in the past. What he discovered were 8 layers of civilization, 8 cities that had never been seen before. Well, it was in the 9th level of the excavation in 1873 where he excavated the cities, streets, and the gates of the ancient city of Troy. And we knew for the first time that what Homer had written about in the Iliad was not fictional, that it was a literal description of our past. And all Heinrich Schliemann did was follow the clues. Could the same thing have happened with us? Is it possible that the answer to some of our deepest mysteries, could those answers be so abundant that they're all around us, and we simply haven't followed the clues that were left to us? What would happen if we did? The discovery of a literal text message in the cells of all life now gives entirely new meaning to our time in history. Earlier I asked a question. I said, what would it mean to find the actual words of an ancient message written as the DNA of each cell of every life? And I'm going to make it more specific. What would it mean to you? Ask yourself this question. What would it mean to you if you found that within every cell of your body, since the time you were born and all those that have come before you, carry an entire library of information, including the clues to understand who you are and where you come from in the past? What would it mean to find that we are so the product of an intentional species that we actually have that message in our bodies? What does that mean to you? Let's take it one step further. Even if we don't know what the message says, at the very least, we know it tells us we're here on purpose. Now, let's take our question one step further. What would it mean to discover that the message inside the cells of your body includes a signature? And what if that signature matched the name of the Creator found in 2,200-year-old scrolls? What if the signature in our cells contains the ancient name of God? There is a very ancient science that underlies the use of numbers that represent letters. This ancient science, and it is a science, of applying numbers to find the deeper meaning in the texts, it is called gematria, G-E-M-A-T-R-I-A, sometimes pronounced gematria, sometimes pronounced gematria. Numerology, if you're familiar with numerology, is a subset. It is derived from this science of gematria. In the 2nd century AD, a rabbi, Eliezer ben Ar-Hosei, actually published 32 rules, rabbinical rules, of precisely how we use these numbers, rules that must be adhered to if we're going to consider the numbers that go with the alphabets. All of the ancient alphabets, including English, which is a relatively modern alphabet, have always had numbers that are linked to the letters. So whether we're speaking about cuneiform or Sanskrit or Chinese, Arabic, Greek, Coptic, Latin, English, ancient Hebrew, all of these alphabets have these mysterious numbers that are linked to the letters. So if we can convert language into number, then we've got a way to read this code in our bodies. If we can turn the DNA in our cells into numbers, we can match those numbers with the numbers of the ancient alphabets, and we can literally replace all of the elements of life with letters and read the code of life as words and sentences. Well, perhaps one of the languages that best lends itself to this process is the alphabet of ancient biblical Hebrew. It is biblical Hebrew that became the first language the cells of our bodies, the message in our cells, was converted into, because Hebrew, by no stretch of the imagination, is the oldest language known to humankind. There are many other languages much older. What makes the Hebrew language so very unique, first of all, it is one of the oldest continuously used languages today. It is such a stable language. It is used today. It's changed very, very little in the last 5,000 years. And the piece that I believe that is so fascinating is that the Hebrew language is the basis for the spiritual and religious traditions of over 1/2 of the world's population. Biblical Hebrew links the three traditions of Christian and Hebrew and Islam through the Old Testament prophet Abraham into the common texts. So if we were ever going to find a principle of peace, and if we wanted to translate a language inside of ourselves into text that would be meaningful to the greatest number of people, to me it makes tremendous sense to translate that language into the words that are linked to our spiritual traditions for over half of the world's population. And for that reason, I chose to begin this project in Hebrew. Since that time, we know that the message also translates into other languages as well, such as ancient Arabic. And it appears that it works in Sanskrit as well, although that research is not quite complete. Well, when we speak about Hebrew texts and Hebrew traditions, for many people the word Kabbalah comes to mind, a collection of esoteric wisdom that has more or less been combined into three major books. One of them is the ancient book of the Zohar, called the Book of Radiance. It literally translates into the Book of Radiance. The second one is called the Midrash, or the Book of Illumination. There's always been a third book. It's a mysterious third book. It has been translated very, very seldom into English. It is believed to be so mystical and such a metaphor that for many scholars, it wasn't worth the time that it took to translate and study. They said it's too symbolic. We can't use this. Well, that book is called the Sefer Yetzirah. It literally translates into the Book of Creation. We don't even know where this book came from. Its origins are unclear. The scholars of the Torah believe it was originally received or transcribed by Abraham, and if that's true, it dates to about the same time as the Vedas of India, almost 4,000 years ago. Well, the book itself, it's a very, very small book, only about 1,000 lines. And in those 1,000 lines, it is if an observer were watching the day that God created the universe and our world and our bodies, and recording line by line what that observer saw as the creation took place. And it begins with the mystery and the power of the letters, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet itself. Let's go back and look at some of these passages. Let's explore them for ourselves and see how they might give us the clues that will help us to translate this message in ourselves. So I'm going to begin by reading a verse, very first verse from the very first chapter in the book of the Sefer Yetzirah. And it simply says, God created the universe with 3 books, is what the Sefer Yetzirah says. He created the universe with text. The word is Sefer, S-E-P-H-E-R. He created the universe with number, Sephar, S-E-P-H-A-R. And he created the universe with communication, Sipur, S-I-P-P-U-R. The text goes on to say now in chapter 2, verse 2, that God created our universe by engraving the letters of the Hebrew alphabet into the emptiness and the void of the nothingness that existed before our world. He engraved the letters, he carved them, he permuted them, he weighed them, he transformed them. And with them he depicted all that was formed, all that would be formed, all that has ever been formed. The text goes on to say that God chose 3 letters from the alphabet and he set them in what is called his great name. So as I was researching the book, The God Code, and I reached this point in the text, I had to ask myself, what is the name of the Creator? Let me ask you a question. If someone walks up to you and says, what is God's name? How do you answer that question? The mystery of God's name is a lingering mystery. One name was held so sacred that it was actually replaced in the ancient text 6,800 times. And that name became the foundation of an entire nation. It's said that when King Solomon began building the nation of Israel, that this name was inscribed on a parchment and placed beneath the cornerstone that still stands today of the great temple on the Temple Mount. One name. What was that name? What is God's ancient name? There is one name that has always been held so sacred, and that name, it is a four-letter name. It is called the Tetragrammaton, literally meaning the four letters of the name. In the Hebrew language, which is a language that is written without the vowels, it is a language of consonants only. It is written from right to left as the Hebrew letters Yud, He, Vav, He, representing the English letters YH, VH. So if we're to ask, what was this one name that was removed 6,800 times, it is the name that is represented by those four letters, YH, VH. It is called the divine name. The true pronunciation, however, has been hidden throughout the ages because the vowels are not recorded. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, when you get to a place in some of the more recent Dead Sea Scrolls, say 2,200 years ago, every place where you see the name of God, it is simply represented by four dots. They won't even write out the letters. I am convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that this name, YHVH, pronounced Yahweh, is the name that was in those original traditions, and it's the name that the Sefer Yetzirah is referring to that seeded or was the catalyst that put into motion the momentum that began all of creation. YHVH. Yahweh is a full name. Now this is important because in the text there is a shorter version that is simply Yah, YH. During the time that I was writing this portion of the book, that the scholars who were translating the Dead Sea Scrolls made an announcement and released information about the scrolls that had not been released previously. What they did was they took over 3,000 of these fragments and they cataloged them separately, photographed them, and released them as a book, a single book. The title of the book is called Discoveries in the Judean Desert, Qumran Cave 4 Unidentified Fragments. What drew my attention to this particular text was of all of those scrolls and all of those fragments, one little piece stood out above all others. Fragment number 66. And on a single little fragment of parchment, one word exists. There are no other letters around it. It is the perfect representation of the four letters of God's ancient name, Yud, He, Vav, He, YH, VH, perfectly preserved, standing alone, all by themselves. So if we are to assume now, continuing with our mystery, that this is in fact the personal name of the Creator in our world, YHVH. The Sefer Yetzirah, this is in chapter 2, verse 5, it goes on once again, even more specifically, it says, all that's formed, all that's spoken, emanates from this one name. So we've got to ask, is this a mystical metaphor, or are these the literal instructions that describe the origins of the universe and life? So in the partial rules of gematria, what we know, number one, is that numbers and letters are interchangeable. The second rule is a rule that makes scientists a little bit crazy, because the rule is that numbers have no decimals. The third rule is that numbers that are equal in value are equal in meaning. If I want to apply gematria to the language of life, to the elements, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, I have to find numbers that represent them. And for every one of those on the periodic table, there's at least 17 different numbers that make every element unique. What I'm going to say right now is this. If you're taking notes, this is the piece that's important. There's only one number that uniquely matches the Hebrew letter codes with the ancient alphabets. And that number is a very mysterious property that we call atomic mass. It is a very, very mystical, very unique property. It doesn't mean how much something weighs, it means how much space it takes up. The atomic mass number, as technical as that sounds, it's very simple. The atomic mass number that we use to describe our elements is the number that links those elements to the letters of the ancient alphabet. So, let's look at the elements of life, the 4 elements that make all life what it is today: hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. And if we look at the atomic mass, the number that represents this: hydrogen is a 1.00, nitrogen 14.00, oxygen 15.99, carbon 12.00. If we treat those modern numbers just the way we would ancient numbers, through gematria, we can reduce those. There are no decimals. We can add them together until they become a single digit. So the 1.00 of hydrogen simply becomes a 1. 14.00 of nitrogen becomes a 5. 15.99 of oxygen becomes a 6. 12.00 of carbon becomes a 3. And the elements of life, now hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, can be represented through the ancient numbers 1, 5, 6, and 3. Now all we have to do is go into the chart of the alphabets and match those numbers, and we can translate the message of the code inside of our cells. The precise details of how this is done, I've described in the book, The God Code. All we're doing is now matching the numbers that we've converted the elements of life into to the letters of the ancient alphabets. And when we do that, the modern element hydrogen becomes the Hebrew letter Yud, or Y. The element nitrogen becomes the Hebrew letter He, or H. The element of oxygen becomes the Hebrew letter V, Vav. The modern element carbon, G, or Gimel. All we've done is we've treated the modern elements as we would with gematria, and we've treated the ancient letters as we would with science. We're giving both ways of knowing the same consideration. In the presence of the message in our cells, God, eternal within the body, we become better people, the very foundation of a better world. So of the many things that this message in our cells says to us today, from my perspective, one stands out above all others. In addition to all of the interesting implications and all the conversations that we can have about the science of evolution and philosophy and religion and spirituality, and as important as all of those things are, we must find a way to become greater than our differences. We must find a way to have peaceful solutions to the things that have separated us in the past. This message reminds us of a single immutable truth, and that truth simply says to us that beyond Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Shinto, Native, Aboriginal, white, black, red, yellow, woman, child, or man, or any other way that we've defined ourselves in the past, the message reminds us that we're a family. We're a family, and we're here to care for one another, and we need one another. And in the moments that we doubt that, we need look no further than the message in ourselves, perfectly replicated within each of the 50 trillion cells of the 6 billion plus people in our world. As a tribute to our success as a species, we each carry a perfect record, the very same record, God eternal within the body. It's a message that lives in every single one of us, and that is the power of unleashing the God Code.